Hello everyone, welcome to the Strategy Supper Club. This lesson is all about kick-ass qualitative research. Qualitative research, when it's done well, is one of the juiciest ingredients that we can have as brand strategists to building amazing brands. And so in this session, we talk about the fundamentals of designing it, what are some of my favorite exercises when I'm doing it, and what are some tips and tricks when I need to speed it up or make it cheaper. So in this session, you'll see me teaching one of my live courses. There's a big old Q&A in the back end. In the comments, you can follow along with Q&A and skip ahead to the questions that you're most interested in. And as ever, we really hope to see you at a session soon. Kick-ass qualitative is, I think, such an integral part of being an effective and amazing strategist. It is something that I really love doing. It's something that takes a lot of effort and time, but it's also something that I feel like is so essential to building the kinds of brands that we can be proud of and that make impact in the world. Now, for a lot of reasons, Qual really sucks. There's so many reasons not to do Qual. You're going to hear this from your colleagues. You're going to hear this from your clients. And a lot of the times, the reasons not to do Qual are things around time and money, and also the big competition of quant. It is so much more seductive to do a quant study for lots of clients because it tends to be faster, cheaper, and your results are more precise. And then on top of it, we're now in this world where we're all hanging out in our houses, and Qual becomes doubly hard to do because we are in this pandemic quarantine world. So there's going to be a lot of people telling you a lot of reasons why you can't do Qual, but I would fight against that because I actually think Qual is totally amazing, and the benefits outweigh the negatives of Qual. Qualitative gives you a depth and nuance that quantitative just can't. And you need that depth and nuance if you're going to build connections with audiences and build the kinds of brands that are really effective in the marketplace. So it's not that it's either or. Ideally, you're able to do both, but be very wary if you're moving ahead with a brand and you haven't incorporated Qual into your processes. Because more often than not, when we forget to do Qual, the brand starts to get a little bit flat and it gets a bit soulless. And I really believe that Qual allows us to have that depth and that richness that we really need to make our brands be like super, super amazing. So today we're going to talk about exploratory Qual. And what I mean when I say exploratory Qual is this is a type of qualitative when we are early into a process. Hold on, we have a little buzz going on here. Someone else needs to come in. All right, got it. Okay. Excuse me about that. Sorry about that. So today we're going to be talking about exploratory Qual. And what I mean by that is this is a type of qualitative that we use to fuel baseline understanding of an audience and how baseline understanding of culture and how a company should relate and understand their audience and go out and do things into the world. Now, there are other kinds of qualitative. There is qualitative that is used to evaluate strategies and creative work. A lot of times that kind of qualitative happens in focus group facilities, in the infamous back rooms with the one-way glass. Qualitative can also be used as a fueling mechanism to build better quantitative, which is a really interesting and cool process that I highly recommend. But we're not going to talk about either of those things today, unless we want to in the Q&A. This presentation is really about that exploratory Qual. But it's not too much different than the other kinds, but it is slightly different, and that's why I just wanted to focus on that one today. Okay. So there's going to be three things that we talk about today. We're going to be talking about like the foundations that you have to build to get qualitative right. We're going to go through some of my favorite exercises that feel free to beg, borrow, and steal those exercises and get them out into the world. And then we're going to talk about how to speed up and make Qual a little bit cheaper. So if you are under time constraints or you're under money constraints, there's a couple of hacks that I do to help it all go a bit faster and a bit cheaper. But let's start with the tight and right foundations, because this is probably the most important thing in getting qualitative right. And the reason that this is so important is that qualitative essentially is very subjective. You don't have the hardness of quant to be able to say like this is true and this isn't true. And so because the exercise is subjective, I like to make sure that the design is super solid, because that gives it a nice frame that you can put all that subjectivity and creativity in, but it still feels bound and controlled. And in the end, that makes it a lot more useful to clients. And it makes clients feel that there's a lot of value in Qual. Or like, it doesn't make them feel it, it makes them recognize that there's a lot of value in Qual. So when I'm doing my design, I make sure that I'm working super closely with clients to make sure everything is 100% clear. And if I detect any fuzz, and what I mean by fuzz is somebody's confused about something, somebody doesn't agree with the decision, somebody doesn't quite understand like why we're making one decision versus another, I will spend as much time as I possibly can in that prep phase and that design phase to make sure that all of that fuzz is ironed out. Because what happens is if you don't iron out that fuzz and you have some creaks in this foundation of the design, those creaks will ultimately influence the output that you're doing and the processes that you're doing around Qual. And that can sometimes make people feel like it wasn't worth it in the end. And we never want people to feel that about the qualitative that we do. So here's a couple of things that I really focus on when I want to get my qualitative thoroughly locked down. It's kind of like no duh, but we need to know the objectives for why we're doing the project. So I like to have one macro objective and at most 3 supplementary objectives for a qualitative design. And the reason that I try to keep it limited, I mean, ideally you would just have one objective for your qualitative, is that if you're trying to jam too many objectives into a study, the study will never be able to answer it. I mean, most of the time we're going to doing Qual, we're spending maybe 2 hours with somebody, and there's only so much information and so much dialogue that you can have in those 2 hours, and having that dialogue in a way that's meaningful where you actually get good insight out of it. So whenever I see a Qual design, like where you can tell like all the stakeholders piled in and everyone wanted their pet thing included in the project, you're just looking at a recipe for disaster. So as much as you can, get those objectives boiled down as tightly as possible, because the tighter the focus of the qualitative, the more successful it's going to be in the long run. Now, some clients want to do hypotheses. I'm not a huge fan of hypotheses, but this will show up in qualitative design a lot, so I just want to make sure I touch on it. These hypotheses are educated guesses about what we're going to uncover in the research that we do. The issue that I have with hypotheses is that they often tend to narrow the focus and sometimes bring in the bias of the people that are either conducting the Qual or paying for the Qual. And so I want to make sure that we know what we want to learn, but I don't want to get too far ahead of myself and thinking this is what I'm going to learn, because I think that'll inevitably bias me as an interviewer and potentially bias clients to be looking for certain outcomes, even if those outcomes aren't true. So if a client asks for it, the one thing that I make sure that we check in what we're doing is what biases might we be bringing into this research, and how can we do hypotheses and work with hypotheses in a way that's not going to bias the way that we conduct it, nor the way that we evaluate the qualitative. The screener. Now, a screener can sometimes be seen as quite a laborious process, but it's fine. It should be, because you want to get your screener so tight and right. Because if you get the wrong people in your qualitative study, your study is probably going to be pretty crap, right? So spend a decent amount of time on the screener. Make sure you get it right. Make sure that you are being really thoughtful about what you're doing with your screener. Because if you get a bad recruit, I've heard this too many times in client situations. Well, it was a bad recruit, so we don't need to listen to what was said in this research. And they'll throw away a lot of research because it's quote unquote a bad recruit. Or you do get a bad recruit where you have half of the people that don't really have value to what you're trying to explore, what you're trying to learn, and you're just wasting a lot of time and you're muddying up the pure insights that you should be getting from your qualitative. So when I'm approaching a screener, there's a few things that I look at. There's the basics: age, geography, gender identification, whether they use your product or not, frequency of shopping, household income, things like that will be in your basics. But basics tend to only narrow things so much. So what I try to do is, of course, I get my basics down, but the next thing I'm looking for are psychographics as well to narrow that down a little bit more. Things like, are they a leader? Are they an early adopter? Are they somebody that is really wary of new things and is going to take a bit of convincing? Like, I want to really think through the psychographic of the person that I am trying to get into the Qual. And whether it's the basics or the psychographics, what I'm looking for are the magic 3. And what I mean by the magic 3 is there are things in a screener that are pretty easy to get. So like when I was working on a menswear brand, it was, okay, we're looking for guys that are aged 29 to 40 who live in urban centers and have a household income above a certain level. And at the end of the day, like finding those guys is super easy. That doesn't count for the magic 3. But if we started to qualify that down a little bit more, saying like we're looking for someone who is interested in grooming. Okay, that narrows it a little bit. But if I say I want to talk to a guy who gets his hair cut every 3 weeks, because that's a signal to me that he's probably really like into grooming and into appearance, that starts to be something that is narrow, and it's a little bit harder to find that guy. And then I might put something like, this is someone who also cares about his appearance, so he goes to the gym 3 to 5, or at least 3 times a week. Okay, you know what? I've done a lot of sport recruiting. As you get up to 3, 4, or 5 days a week at the gym, things narrow. And so what I'm looking for are the magic 3 things that are going to take a broader population and narrow them down a bit. So I know that I'm getting someone that's a little bit more specific, that has a little bit more edge, a little bit more teeth to the way that they are going to relate to the study. Now, I try to do 3, no less than 3, or else you start to get like just anybody can get into your study. But if you go more than 3, it's going to start to be quite difficult to recruit, and it's going to take more time and more money. Now, sometimes on some projects you have to do it, and sometimes you have clients that want a really specific recruit, and so they're willing to spend the time and money. But I find if you keep it to 3, you can get it done in a usual recruit window, which is about a week to 2 weeks. And if you have to spend more time for maybe you have 4 or 5, that's a conversation you should have with clients. But don't do less than 3, or else you kind of get like just anybody starts to get into your study, and then it just kind of means nothing. Okay. And then the other thing that really needs to be sorted out in a big way is your discussion guide. Now, I put here like a typical flow, like most discussion guides. I would say 90% of them have a warm-up. There's a section where you're trying to understand this person's life more holistically. Then you're going into the category, how they relate to men's clothing at large. Then you might go into the specific brand that you're talking to, and then you'll do cleanup of just things that need to be taken care of and some housekeeping stuff. Now, you know, once you write like a ton of discussion guides, of course, you can mess around with these categories. You can shift them around. You can add a different category in. But when I'm teaching people like basic discussion guide writing, and when I'm writing my own, mentally I'm ticking off these 5 categories and understanding that they're either in or there's a reason that they're out. So these are the basic ones. Of course, we play with it. But if you are starting from scratch, use this as your initial guide. Okay, so let's go into some exercises that I like. Now, it might not surprise a lot of you on this call, especially if you've been in more than one of these supper clubs, is that I tend to be stubborn about some of my biases. And a stubborn bias that I have about Qual, I'm really stubborn about Qual, actually. And one way that the main way that I'm really stubborn about Qual is that I'm always aiming for Qual that is in the person's place and is projective. So I like to go where they live, and I like to discuss concepts through creation first and language second. I do not believe in doing exploratory Qual in a research facility. In fact, when I ran my own company, WW, we did tons of Qual. We did so much Qual, and we did tons of exploratory Qual. I am very proud to say that we never did a single session in a focus group facility, because I just believe that you can't get real with people when you're putting them in a fake environment. And nothing signals a fake environment more to a person than being shuttled into one of these facilities, being put in the room, being like right in front of the glass, knowing that there's a group of people watching them behind the glass. It's like, it's creepy. And I just don't think this is a good place to get truth or to get insight. So when I'm doing exploratory Qual, I actually have like a professional rule that I will not do it in focus group facilities. I realize not all of us have the luxury to be able to say that to clients, but I do. So this is my stubborn bias. I've actually lost money over this bias. Okay. So rant over. Let's talk about one of the exercises I like, which should be no surprise based on what I just said, which is I just like to hang out with people. And we might, if we're getting fancy, we're going to call this ethnographic Qual. But this just comes from the thinking that I think environments really shape us and reflect us. Like, I can tell so much more about a person if they let me into their home or if they let me into their bedroom than sometimes the interview itself. So I love to design Qual where I ask a participant to take me through their lives. And I'll ask them things like, take me to the place where you're the happiest, or take me to the place where you had a really proud moment, or take me to a place where something really freaked you out. It's just a really great way to get to know a person and get to know their lives. Now, when you're doing Qual like this, you're obviously not sitting there with your discussion guide, like checking off the questions and answers. You're probably like rolling around their town in their car. You're sitting in the passenger seat. So the really important thing when you're doing Qual like this is to have that discussion guide firmly locked in your head so you can find the right moments to ask the questions that you need to ask. Okay. The next thing I really like to do is I like to change the dynamic between myself and a respondent, and I like to have them teach me something. We deployed this a lot when we were working in the athletic space. So say we were working on like a tennis brand, and like, I don't play tennis, like I'm a fool on a tennis court, but put me on a tennis court with the respondent if they're really into tennis and have them give me a lesson. It changes the dynamic. Instead of me coming in as a stranger that's paying them to answer questions and they're a little bit uptight because they have to they're trying to do a good job. And a lot of Qual people will come in with that. They want to do a good job, and sometimes that can stress them out. When you ask them to be the expert and you ask them to teach you something, the dynamic changes. And they will get more confident. They will get more loose. And I find that you get really great insights when you ask somebody to teach you something. So if you're ever doing anything like where you're going into a space where you're talking to people that are really good at something or really passionate about something, consider at least having part of the exercise be having them teach you something. And you're going to see a really cool dynamic start to open up between you and the respondent. Xbooks. Xbooks is one of my favorite tools. I'm really proud of this tool. It's a tool that we developed at W&W. And essentially what an Xbook is, it's a workbook that we send ahead to a respondent that is full of projective exercises. So we just would go to Muji. We would buy stacks and stacks. We'd buy cases of Muji notebooks. And for every study, we would fill them out. We'd put prompts on about 10 pages. And we would be aiming for about an hour's worth of exercises where we would ask respondents to make things for us. Make us a collage of your dream home if we were doing something for home ownership, or draw us an athlete of the future if we were talking to young kids about sport, or draw us the school of the future if we were looking to understand how people who are about to go to college really wanted to relate to and see facets of the universities that they were applying to. And so what we were doing here is that we were doing a projective exercise that was one moment away from the question that we actually wanted to get to. But when we would get the Xbooks back and interview them, the projective exercise became the through vehicle that we could talk to them, understand them, and get to the ultimate answers that we were looking for. And the great thing about having people do projective exercises is that a lot of times, especially when we spend a lot of time in a space, we start to develop patterns of language and patterns of jargon. And we answer things the same way every time that we get asked a similar question. You'll see this a lot in client organizations, like when you're doing stakeholder interviews and you go to the boss and you say, tell me about your company. And they kind of have this template of the way that they talk about the company. They were probably coached by their communications team to stick to that template. The cool thing is saying, well, I'll go to a company person, I'll go to a CEO, I'll say, draw me a picture of what makes you proud about the company, or draw me a picture of what you want this company to look like in 5 years. And all of a sudden, I've broken their language, their crutches. They have language crutches. And I've taken those crutches away from them. And I've said, hey, you know what, let's explore this in a different conceptual way. Xbooks are doing that. And I use Xbooks a lot for audiences that I think might have a hard time working with a researcher. We originally did these because we had to go out and interview 8 to 10-year-olds. It was one of the first Gen Z studies I ever did. And we were just worried that an 8 to 10-year-old would be kind of intimidated by a researcher coming in to ask them questions. And so we're like, well, why don't we get them to draw? That's probably going to loosen them up a bit. And it worked magically. And so then we started using it. We used it in a study for guys that were age 19 to 22, because what we found with guys a lot of times is they also get a little bit nonverbal and can kind of clench up when a researcher comes in. So we used it with great success for them. So anytime that I'm dealing with somebody who's about 21 years old and younger, I definitely think Xbooks is one of the first methodologies that I will put in my mental list of maybe we should try to use that one. So love Xbooks. I can talk about them forever. And the really cool thing about Xbooks is that when you get them back, you have all this amazing creative fodder that you can then show to clients. And clients love paging through Xbooks. And it makes your report that much better. And it makes that meeting with your clients when you're presenting the report that much better, because I've done this several times. I just walk in with a crate of Xbooks and I put it down on the conference room table, and people just love digging in. It's a great way to spark conversation with your clients as well. Okay. Utopia Dystopia. I actually did this exercise this week with a set of people where when I want to really understand what people are hopeful about, what people love, what people are freaked out about, what people hate, I will have them do Utopia Dystopia. And the reason that I think it's so important to get to emotions like love and hate and anger and hope and things like that is that those are what I call edge emotions. And edge emotions are just like some of the most fertile building blocks of great brands. Because if you can build a brand around what people love, or if you can build a brand to answer things that really make people angry, you are that much more likely to be resonant with your audiences. And so I use Utopia Dystopia to get to those edge emotions. And I ask people a very simple prompt. If we say, let's go back to the home ownership, show us a utopia of what a home would look like for you. And they'll do it. They'll show you all those things. They'll tell you why they made those decisions. They'll tell you the things they love, because utopia means like the absolute best, right? Or on the other side, I'll say, show me a dystopia. What is your nightmare when it comes to buying a home? What would be a dystopia home for you? And it will unveil all the values and the things that they really dislike. And so it's a really great exercise to like get under the skin and expose emotions that are central and core and really potent to people. Okay. Sometimes you just got to ask people to fix it. Agencies make a lot of money by being the middlemen. Like, we're going to go out and do this study. We're going to go figure out, okay, all the things that people are feeling and blah, 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 all this stuff. We're going to bring back the insights from the research. We're going to present it to your team. We're going to do an innovation work stream with you guys for a while where we're going to bring in professional creators to create against these insights and solve your problems. And we're going to work that through your system. And then some other people are going to come in and we're going to do another set of workshops. And these processes could just go on for so long as we are creating against a set of insights. And sometimes it's just bullshit. Sometimes you don't need to do it. Sometimes you can just go to the people that you want to influence or you want to like engage with your brand and ask them what the brand needs to do. So like an example of this, like I've never worked on this brand before, but if Microsoft came to me and said, we want to make Microsoft really cool to 21-year-olds, my first instinct would be, cool, I'm going to set up a creation lab for them. A creation lab is a room that has like a lot of different stations, a lot of different creative materials, prompts, challenges. I'm going to put a bunch of really interesting, smart, articulate 21-year-olds in a room, and I'm just going to ask them to say, how can we make Microsoft cool? What do we need to do? And a lot of times when you just hand the reins over to people this is where your screener is really important. You need awesome recruit to do this. But if you get an awesome recruit of people who are super dynamic and amazing and creative and energetic, you can solve brand problems and you can cut out these processes by months. So I really love Fixit. Like, just let me moderate it. It can be kind of tough to moderate. You have to work with somebody if you haven't moderated one of these before, or like just be on your toes if you haven't moderated one of these before. But it's a really great way just to cut through the crap and solve the problem that the client needs solved. Okay, net, I think one of the most important things in all of this is like just get people engaging, get them teaching, get them creating, shake up the dynamics so it's not passive. All right, quick last section on speeding it up. There are 3 things that slow down qualitative: recruiting, fielding, evaluating. Let's talk about how we can speed up each of those. Recruiting, tap into existing pools. There are research companies that keep relationships up with certain types of profiles of people. If you can find one of these, it can sometimes cut your recruiting time in half. Other thing that I will do is that I'll just start creating my own pool. I have a spreadsheet just full of people that I think are interesting, who have been good qualitative respondents in the past. I have their information. So I just keep track of that. So if I need to do a quick recruit later on, I can just tap into my own pool, call up those people, and a lot of times they're really happy to be paid money to talk about themselves. So existing pools are great. Second thing I like doing is a friend recruit. Again, if say I have to recruit like 20 guys, and it's kind of a tough recruit and we have to go fast, I'll recruit 4 And I'll ask those 4 to find 4 other guys that they think are kind of like them and they're friends. And I'll do a friendship recruit and I'll do a friendship group. That speeds up my recruiting process quite a bit. And friendship groups are always fun because friendship groups, people like, once they get comfortable, they'll start giving each other shit. They'll call each other out when they're not telling the truth. Friend groups are really powerful tools to get to truth quite quickly. Digitally, the F out of it. I mean, this is the world we're living in right now. So running panels really works. I like running week-long panels. A week-long panel can sometimes get you more insight than a 2-hour interview because you have people not only answering the prompts, but you have them commenting on each other. So week-long panels are great. I will do Xbooks. I'll have them FedEx the Xbook back to me and do a video chat instead of going in field. So you get all the richness of the projective exercise, but you're speeding it up by doing video. So it's kind of like a win-win. You could also set up Xbook digitally and do a Google Slides presentation and just have them fill in a Google Slides. That also works as well. And another thing that I like to do in digitally and making it digital and faster is play in their environments. So if I'm working with a target group that I know just naturally is all over Pinterest, we might not even be like dealing with a Pinterest study. It might be a study on something totally different. But if I know that that target market most likely is on Pinterest, I will ask them to make me pin boards. Again, it's another way to get out of language, get to projection, but you're using a platform that they're super fluent in and comfortable. So the creation is probably going to be really good. I also like doing iterative evaluation. I do this in field a lot. And I also do this when I do stakeholder interviews in a company, especially when I have to do like 20 stakeholder interviews over the course of a week. When I'm doing iterative evaluation, I always give myself breaks in between being in field or being in interview so I can actually do the analysis along with the interviews. So how this might work is like, say I'm supposed to spend 3 days in field in a market. Instead of doing Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and then going back to New York and like having all that information and trying to process it on, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and because the client wants to see something on Monday, what I'll do instead is I'll do a group of Qual on Monday. I will take Tuesday to do evaluation of what I heard on Monday. Ideally, what works really well is if you have your clients with you, you can workshop with them so they can also decide like what was really interesting that they heard. Then I'll go into Wednesday knowing like that we had some direction from Monday. And then I'll take Thursday again to do evaluation. And then I'll go into field on Friday. And by the time I go home on Friday, I've actually done about 60 to 70% of the evaluation. And it makes it much easier for me to deliver the end product to the client more quickly. Okay, quick recap, and I'm going to open it up. There are a lot of reasons not to do Qual, but Qual gives you the juice that Quant just can't. Quant's amazing, but Qual's different, and we really just need to continue to value Qual in the industry. Design is everything. Work hard to get it tight and right. It's going to make your life so much easier. An extra day of wrangling a client to get the design right is going to pay massive dividends in the future of a qualitative project. And then finally, just remember that the more you can make it immersive, projective, creative, the richer and better insights you will get at the end of the day. All right, let's discuss. I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to open it up. And because there's a decent amount of people in today, if you could just unmute and I'll call on you, that would be fantastic.
So I'm a student, but I work for a student startup agency here at my university. It's completely student run. We're nonprofit. We've got a small roster of about 11 clients. And I help pilot our strategy division for the company. And I still have clients that are requesting focus groups amid this COVID-19 situation. So we're having to use technology like Zoom, et cetera. Like, what are your tips for navigating this kind of like this atmosphere of not being able to meet in person or go to where they are and experience the brands that we're working for with them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a great question. A couple of things. So something that I've learned from running these sessions is I get much better energy from the group if I ask the group who you are, where you're calling in from, and then to add one more thing. So I've tried to run this group a couple of times where I just say, who are you, where are you calling in from, when I do the beginning. And I don't know if it's just small sample size, but I find that the groups that I do that with don't ask as many questions and aren't as engaged in the Q&A. So one piece of advice I would give you is take the time in the upfront to let people open up a bit and let them talk and share a little bit about who they are. Something else that I would recommend doing is, to the earlier point with what Gloria was asking, it's one thing to see their social feeds so you can like get into their space digitally, right? But something else that I like doing is actually giving them photography assignments where it's like, show me what your kitchen looks like on a normal day, right? Things that they wouldn't post online, but you give them assignments. And these are ways of understanding their spaces more while using digital tools, but getting to things that they might not readily post on social media. So giving the assignments is a really good way to, when you cannot get to somebody, seeing some of their reality without having to rely on the social feed. Like a client that this worked brilliantly with, I was working on a men's clothing brand, and we just said, please go take a picture of your closet. And, it's really interesting when you just take a snap of your closet versus you take a snap of an Instagram closet. Right. And a way to make that more time-based is if you do a text type of study where you're texting people at a certain time of day, and you say within an hour, can you take a picture of this? And if you're doing anything that's related to home, people should be able to do it. That will help make sure that people aren't trying to pretty things up to get you the stimulus that you need.
How often is it you guys do qualitative to find an insight, or do you use it more to kind of justify direction or kind of cement an idea you guys or direction you want to go in?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that's the difference between, so the kind of qualitative we're talking about today is the exploratory stuff, which is all about finding like core insights, figuring out like who people are, how they relate to the world. You can find out what expectations they have of the company that you're working for and get like those types of insights. So it's really about cultural insights, how they relate to the world, audience insights, how they feel about themselves, category insights, like how is the category serving them or not, and if the client wants to learn about themselves, like client insights, like what is the instinctual relationship between them and the client. And you're finding these out like at a broad emotional primal level. The stuff you're talking about, oh, we have a creative idea, let's go figure out if it's working. That's what I would call like evaluative qualitative. And that does happen a lot more in focus group rooms, like where you roll out a couple concept boards or you roll out a couple videos and you get people's reactions to them, which is not what we talked about today. But it is definitely a lot of the qualitative that happens in the world is that qualitative.
Do you ever worry that you're kind of getting, you might bring some bias in because they're sort of like professional research respondents and that they're giving that same feedback frequently? Does that worry you? Like, do you prefer not to use those? What's your view there?
Oh, yeah. So that's a great point. A lot of times I use the platform, but I won't use their recruit. So again, it all gets back to your recruit. And if you're worried about a false recruit like that, use a recruiter that you trust or do the friends version of recruiting.
Yeah,
you can break through that.
And I had a follow-up question.
Sure.
So on the screeners for the psychographic part of it,
mm-hmm.
how do you get at that? What questions do you ask to figure that out?
You ask questions like, I like it. I'm the one that usually gives my friends advice on what tech product to buy is a good way to find an early adopter. Or people usually follow. I like it when people listen and follow my recommendations. Or I don't like trying things too new. I always wait a little bit longer before I'll buy a new technology. That's a second level adopter.
Yeah.
So you just kind of ask I questions like that.
We have a lot of questions that we'd like to do research around. And because I work in-house as a marketer, a lot of those we are focused on a specific audience, usually like our customers or our users.
Mm-hmm.
And so I really, your suggestion to really focus on like one objective really resonates, but so does my desire to like minimize how much like shoulder tapping we're doing and saying, hey, can we interview you about this? Hey, can we interview you about that? So do you have any suggestions on like striking that balance, or is it really just getting tight? Like on you said, like forget the terminology you used around like the things that really tighten like your pool of participants.
Yeah. So I have a couple of suggestions on that. One is you could go into a qualitative design and say, we're going to have 2 hours with you today, and we're going to have 3 sections to this, and we're going to work on 3 problems in this section, right? And that way, for a smaller company that's trying to be more efficient, you can knock out a couple of your objectives. And it's almost like you're treating each objective like its own little mini qual session that's like a half hour long, right? And you just make sure when you're moderating that you're really upfront with your participants of like, it's going to shift. Like we're going to section 1, 2, and 3. And, participants are usually game for stuff like that. They're cool with that kind of stuff. Another thing that you can do in a situation like this, if you're afraid of like finger tapping them all the time, which I totally understand, is actually set up that relationship with them from the get-go. Like go through a group with them, identify the ones you love, or even just identify a group of people and say, hey, I would love to be able to tap you once a quarter and ask for 2 hours of your time once a quarter. Would you be open to that? Here's how much we'll pay, blah, 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 all that stuff.
And it's like a customer advisory board or like similar kinds of concepts. Yeah.
I love taking my best qualitative participants and turning them into ongoing advisors for the brand. I do that a lot, actually. And I think you could probably do that. And people like doing it, honestly. It makes them feel important. It makes them feel smart.
Yeah. Awesome presentation. Really, really enjoyed it. So regarding the design of the qualitative work, you mentioned that like there's some trouble that you can get into if you are like too narrow with an objective at the beginning that kind of ends up affirming a bias, right? Mm-hmm. So can you give some examples around like what's the right amount of objectives, and like can you give us some shape in terms of like what's open enough versus too narrow?
Yeah.
Or too open for that matter?
That's a good question. So the thing that I worry about is going in with narrow hypotheses, that like you're going to go in and say, we're going to test that our hypotheses is that these guys really dislike our brand because we did X, Y, and Z a year ago. And as soon as you bring that mindset in, it's like, yeah, okay. It's like almost affirms itself, right? But say I wanted to like investigate those guys. An objective I might put in there is like explore how brand X can really inspire these guys. Understand the barriers that they have to interacting with our brand, right? So to me, like those objectives, they're broad enough, and those are actually a little too broad. I would probably tighten the language a little bit more on those. But I'm not going in and saying like, I know what's going on here and I'm just going to go like figure that out. I'm going in with more of a broader point of view. I'd actually rather have objectives be like a core objective be broader, like figure out what inspires them versus being too narrow. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
It's the hypotheses that I worry about. It's when you go in with hypotheses and when you go in with too many objectives. So I'm okay with having a broader objective about like what inspires people, or maybe what inspires people when they are looking for this type of experience in their life. Like that's like a nice objective. What I don't like is an objective that is just like, or a hypothesis that's going to like predetermine what the answer is going to be. That's where I get nervous.
I'm thinking about some of the clients that I've had in the past and how I would go about trying to sell through, like, I'm going to go hang out with someone for a week. Here's how that's valuable. It sounds like you've universally moved to that. So what is the process like for you if you're taking a client who's more used to kind of focus groups in a facility and bringing them to that space?
That's a great question, Liston. Sometimes you can't move someone it's tough to move someone from like a focus group culture all the way to a ethnographic immersive culture. So a lot of times I will do in between methodologies before I take them all the way to hardcore ethnographic immersive. So I will start to do things like X books. I will do things like a creation lab to break them out of the mold. And then if they're feeling pretty confident and good, then we try the immersive in a tighter design. So saying, I'm not going to hang out with these people for a week, but I'd like to hang out with people for a half day, or okay, we'll do some backroom work, although I won't do backroom work, but let's just say I will do it. We'll do some backroom work, but then can we do a day where I hang out with somebody for 2 half days and like do the blend? Because sometimes you just have to baby step people out of the norms that we know.
I loved the fixit idea. I often informally have used that method, but I could see that if a client is super close to the research, they just kind of like say, oh, I love this. I heard this idea. I love this idea and I'm going to run with it. Is there a way to keep that from happening if it's not the right fit? How do you kind of troubleshoot the, like, there's less of a barrier for like that interpretation?
That's a great question, Carol. I think so much of great qualitative, like we talked about before, I've said it a bunch of times, is all in the prep, right? So if you're going to do a fix-it session, something to put down ahead of time are the parameters of what a great idea ultimately would be. And I would share the parameters with the people who are creating, but also have some really intense conversations with the client about, okay, at the end of the day, we're going to get all these ideas, probably 80 to 90% of them are going to be crap. And that's okay, because it's just, that's the creative process. That's how it works, right? But when we are looking at the 10% that we really like, what are the strong filters that we're going to put them through to make sure that they fit the standard of what we should do moving forward? So it's in your preparation with your client.
Question around how do you go about doing these types of exercises like Xbooks, Utopia Dystopia, Fixit with like senior business decision makers or internal like stakeholders? Like how do you get them in that mindset or that frame of thought? Because I feel like my experience has been that they're so rigid. And so I'm just curious if you have any tips.
Yeah. You mean getting them to sign off on doing research like that, or getting them to participate in something like that? Participate themselves. Yeah. So I have this whole run of data points about how important creativity is to business and how important it is to making decisions. And whenever I'm running into client cultures that don't want to take the leap into doing creative types of exercises, I just send them some data about creativity. And there's some real like hardcore data around how creativity helps businesses, how it helps unlock insights, how it helps unlock innovation. So you can use that. Another thing similar to the earlier point that Liston was making, it's kind of easing them into it. So if they're more comfortable with one kind of way of interacting with someone like you, say, hey, I've said this to so many CEOs. I've said this 1,000 times. I'm the crazy brand person, right? Like, I'm just asking you to go with me for an hour and then we're going to do this other stuff. And I know you're going to be totally cool with that, but just indulge me. Just indulge me for an hour. And I will, I can't tell you, Lexi, how many times I've run that voice track of like, and like the shaved head helps, I'm the crazy one, let me, And so a lot of times all you need to do is just get them to experience a taste of it. And then they're going to be much more open to it further down the road. So don't try to win the war right away. Just focus on the battle first, and then you will eventually win the war if you do it properly.
Hi, really good presentation. Thank you so much for that, Heidi. I've got a question about something that you mentioned all the way at the beginning about, even before you get to designing the whole process. How do you manage the amount of stakeholders that could and very often want to have an input in the objectives, in the outputs, in how it's being conducted? What's your advice in terms of managing, expectations as well as level of seniority and level of people and their input?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Lena. I think you have to get ahead of it. So if you think there's going to be multiple stakeholders, instead of walking into a room and saying, okay, we're going to design here's the proposed design for the workshop, or let's roll up our sleeves and design it together. What I walk in with is saying, here's what I know makes for great qualitative design, right? We limit it to this many objectives. We limit it to this number of respondents. We only have so many people in field. We have this kind of output versus that kind of output. And I almost set the frame of the rules before we start the design, so they know the frame that they have to fill. And it helps me come in so they don't think that I'm trying to get my own pet design through. I start talking about the principles of great design versus the great design that I want them to buy off on. And if I can get the principles sold through first, that can help me manage difficult client dynamic. And it also gives me permission to say, yes, ultimately we can break this rule, but then all of us have to hold hands and know that this research might not be as effective because of these reasons. And so you're letting them break the rule, but you're also saying, hey, like, I'm telling you, there's a great way to do this and there's a bad way to do this. You are choosing the less good way to do it. And we're all going to be held responsible for that decision. Or you're going to be held responsible for that decision.
But you mentioned bringing clients into the field with you. Do you have an approach or strategy on making sure that they are not interjecting or influencing? Like, do you have a sit down beforehand of like, okay, here's your sandbox?
I mean, some clients I won't even offer it to. Okay. So very clear about that. There are some clients you just do not want in field with you, because a lot of times, like, the biggest issue I have is them just being weirdos around people and they can't just like chill out and be like, cool, you know, like, just calm down. It's fine. So abso-fucking-lutely, if you're going to bring a client into Qual with you, you are in my world. You're playing by my rules. These are the rules, right? And you got to be nicer than that because they're your clients, obviously. But like, you just got to make it very clear of like, this is a practice. This is something that needs to be handled a certain way. And here are the ways that I would love for you to be a part of this team. And also, like, if you know your client is an interjector, or if you know your client like will not be able to not hold their tongue and ask them a question and interject themselves, say, look, at the end or at this point in the discussion guide, I'm going to turn to you and I'm going to say, do you have any questions at this point? That's your chance. But then I'm going to turn back to me and I need you to like let me run it from there on out. So one thing to do with this is don't fight. If you're bringing that client into Qual, don't fight their natural personality. Make a space for it so it has a place to breathe, but it's also contained.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, look, like half the art of planning, I was talking to someone about this earlier today, like half of the art that we do, like, yeah, there's skills, right? And I could write like 50 decks about all the skills that you need to know. Like, I could write a deck on like how you write a discussion guide or how you do a comms plan or any of that shit. But at the end of the day, half of our discipline has nothing to do with the hard skills and has everything to do with like who we are as people and how we interact, right? And I think that's what makes for really great strategists. And so like, even with these decks that I share out, like, I think they're great, but really it's like how you apply them as a human and how you think through the skills and what you do with them is actually the magic of becoming a great strategist. That's my little soapbox moment for you all today.
I come from kind of a content strategy background, and I've worked with many strategists, both brand and content or social, who are kind of seeing things like social media as a form of digital ethnography. I know that's not really a method that we covered today, but I'm just curious from your perspective, how you would value things like digital or social and the kinds of qualitative insights that we can glean from there. I kind of immediately think of Sparks and Honey and the work that they're doing, branding cultural strategy as an aspect of that.
Yeah. And I think like, look, I have a lot of respect for Sparks and Honey, and I think a lot of the work that they do is great. And using the digital stuff that's out there already, of course you should do that, right? And one of the things, and thank you for bringing this up, Gloria, one of the things that I always ask for when we do recruit someone is, what are your handles? Because inevitably we are going to go look at what they're doing if they're not private, and how we can learn from that. So I think those things are really good. I think those things are also, we just have to be slightly careful with it. And this is why I like balancing it with, good old fashioned Qual, because how many of us are completely honest about our lives on Instagram or Twitter? I mean, I'm not, you know what I mean? And I don't know anybody that really is, unless you could get into their Finsta. And I don't even know if people are really doing the Finstas anymore. But like, if they're not going to, there are the spaces where people are doing that really intimate social posting. A lot of times they're not going to let a researcher into that. So I just think we have to be, just cognizant of the fact that the things that we put in the open social space are the things that are a bit, they're filtered. We're filtering our own existence. And I think the best Qual does acknowledge, like, when you see what you filter, it is saying like, this is what you value. right? Like this is what you want people to perceive you as. This is your aspiration. So that's really important information. But I like marrying that with some more of the grubbier insights about what people aren't so willing to expose, and what can we learn from them about that.
Really good points. Thank you. I've worked with quite a few social turn brand strategists who feel like social is kind of the first frontier of understanding user insights and such. And I think your response is really insightful. Thank you.
And the daily routine of the agents, as big agents, we have less and less time to do qualitative research. We tend to use GA data, data from social listening and other kind of data. Do you have any tips to insert qualitative research into the agent's culture and the planning department? How can we do that?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Whenever I run into a client or an agency that's super dependent on social scraping to understand a market, I just ask them, how honest are you in your social media about who you are? And usually people are like, fair, right? So I think social media scraping and data scraping is really valuable as one way of understanding a market, because also the way that you present yourself is your aspiration and what you want to be. But what I think is even more interesting for brands is not just the way you present yourself, but the gap between what your experience really is and the way you present yourself, because that's where brands, there's a lot of juice in that gap, right? So I think it's just pointing out just the human truths around the limitations of social media and the truthfulness of social media. I also use, and I think I said it when I was going through the deck today, of like, data tells us very much where we've been, but qualitative really helps us see the future and where we can go. And that's really important. But I think one of the things in there, Leo, and I know I talked about it before a bit too, so I'm sorry for being redundant, is it's never about getting rid of quant. Quant is really valuable, and these other tools play such a huge role. It's about complementing it and offering up ways that you can supplement it. So if it's a really quant-focused agency or client, say, cool, we're going to run the crap out of your quant. We're going to do all that stuff. Would you mind if I talk to 5 people here and just do some quick qual? And sometimes this is about starting with a nibble and then showing the value of that nibble and then doing a bigger nibble, a bigger bite next time. So smashing in and saying, I'm not doing it this way or whatever, usually doesn't work in those situations.
One thing I've struggled with is like kind of trying to shift like a potential target for a brand. So suggesting that they use like maybe aspirational consumers, but then kind of coming back with the results and the clients thinking like, oh, this actually isn't relevant because these aren't our consumers. They're almost too aspirational. Mm-hmm. And so I just wonder if you have any experience on how to make the case for an aspirational audience, like in the upfront phase.
Yep.
And yeah, just how to make that shift.
I'm so glad you asked this question, because I got to do a class on this because everyone asks a question around this. And this is one of my favorite things to do with brand theory. So something that I really love doing with clients, if it's the right kind of client, is to do a muse approach to brand development. And what I mean by that is when you're developing the brand overall, like who the brand is, what it stands for, all that big, juicy umbrella stuff, I love working with them to identify an aspirational audience. And the way that I have them think about this is, this might not be your volume target, but these are the people that if they liked you without you having to pay them to like you, like if they proactively posted you on their Instagram, you would be so psyched. And basically it's the bar of like, who is the absolute apex of the person that you want to love your brand, and who in many ways is going to be one of the more difficult people to get to love your brand because they might be so discerning or so cool or so courted or whatever, right? So what I do with clients is we will build their umbrella macro brand, their philosophy, why they exist, what they do in the world. We'll build that around that aspirational consumer. We'll go do qualitative around them. And then we get to their commercialization of the brand. And this is where their consumer segments come in, right? So we've built this brand up here based on the aspiration. Now it's time to sell shit. So then what we do is we go out, we do quantitative, and we figure out our segments of commercialization. And we take that person and we go understand them super well. And we map them, we figure out the Venn. Where does that person, you've created this brand that's amazing. How does this amazing brand map to this person and get them to feel a part of it? So let me give you a real world example of this. Glossier is a great example of this. Glossier is built for very cool millennial women, right? I am not a very cool millennial woman. I am not, sadly. But I would bet that I am a segment of Glossier. And I would also bet that I probably buy more Glossier than any of those younger women because I have a higher disposable income. In fact, my face right now is covered in Glossier. It's the only makeup brand I buy, right? Because I'm lazy. So, what I am of Glossier is I am a 41-year-old woman who is a commercial segment of Glossier. They built the brand to appeal to millennial women around a premise of like fresh beauty, all this type of stuff. As a 41-year-old, I can relate to natural beauty. Like I get it, but I'm not like their hardcore typical consumer, even though I probably bring in way more volume than their aspirational consumer. And so that to me is the difference. And I built a ton of brands this way. And this is the Nike model. This is how Nike does it. Nike builds an entire category off of muses. And then when it comes to sell it to a specific consumer, they apply that category that they built for the muse to that consumer and pull the consumer up into their aspirational brand world. I'm sorry that was a long explanation, but I hope that was helpful.
No, super helpful. Just one quick follow-up, if you don't mind.
Of course.
Which is, how do you make the case for the muse then? Like, is it just kind of, yeah.
It's, a lot of times I say to my clients, and this usually makes it click for them, is like, you want to build the most amazing aspirational brand ever. So you need to build it for people that are going to push you. And a muse should push you. A muse should push you to create at a higher level, be as creative as possible, as service-oriented as possible, or whatever. So like if I'm Amazon, I'm going to create for the person that's clicking on Prime 3 times a day, because there's probably not a lot of people that are doing that. But if you can satisfy them, you can figure out how to satisfy almost everybody else. And that's how I sell the muse. Like the muse is the most difficult person to satisfy, but if you can get them, it's actually a lot easier to get your commercial segments down the road.
But they have to be someone almost like the most difficult person to satisfy, but still almost a little bit within reach. So not so aspirational that it's impossible to imagine, right, but like you're most challenging within your like current frame.
Exactly. It's not like J-Lo.
Yeah.
Right. But it's like, if it's a kind of thing that you like, it might be like some really persnickety housewives might be your aspirational muse, right? Which then your suburban housewives might be like, ooh, I kind of want a taste of that, so I'm going to buy into this brand, I think this is what I'm going to do my thing on next week, because I get this question almost every session. So muse versus commercial. I think we're going to do that next. Thank you for pushing me there, Anna.
This has been great. Thanks so much. A question I often get is, what's the magic number for participants? And I know that often comes down to the unique burden of proof for that client, the project, but wondering what you think about sample sizes and how you determine the right number of participants for any study.
So you start to get repetition after about 6 to 8 interviews. So 6 is the minimum that I'll do in a population. And I'm semi-comfortable stopping at 6. I'm very comfortable stopping at 8. And there is some sort of data around that somewhere. I don't know the data off the top of my head, but I do a lot of Qual quant, like where I work with a really awesome quant partner. And Tom has always told me that if you do 8 interviews, you've got it, you're good. You're going to start to get into repetition of theme, which has been absolutely my experience. Like once you hit 8, you're starting to get repetition. If your screener's good.
How have you managed to ward off all this focus group fake environment bullshit that can be such a fight? I mean, I get it right about 70% of the time, but it keeps coming back.
I know. So I'm going to tell you something I'm really proud of. When I ran W&W for 5 years, we never once did a focus group facility qualitative group the entire time. And I was like, wow, we did it. Like we never had to do it. And it really was taking the advice of one of my really good friends. So I'm going to go into a little bit of a wax poetic here for a second, but just bear with me. We're in quarantine. We're allowed to do this shit now. Really early in W&W, an amazing assignment came in, amazing, let's say, financial assignment came in. Had we taken the assignment, W&W would have been set for like 2 years. And this was like 3 months into the company starting when we're still super scrappy. You know, it was that thing. And when I looked at the assignment, I knew deep down that if we took this, that it would change the company in a way and make it into something that I never wanted it to be. In fact, it would go against many of the reasons why I started the company. I'd have money and security, but it would go against it. And I was wrestling with it because, you know, you have employees and you got to like pay their bills, and we were running out of projects, and it was that early time. So I called my really good friend, Paul Malmstrom, who is one of the founders of Mother and in New York. And Paul said something to me that I will never, ever, ever forget. And he said, Heidi, if you want the right things to come in, you have to make room for them to come in. And if you take this assignment, it's going to take up all of your room. And the stuff that you really want to do won't have the room to come in. And it was just this profound piece of advice. So the next day I called the client and I said, I'm sorry, we can't take the assignment. When I only had like 3 weeks of cash flow in the bank, you know, and then literally 2 days later, the perfect phone call came in with the perfect project, and we were off and running as a company. And I do believe this, and it happened too many times at W&W to say like it's like universal woo-woo bullshit. Like too many times we said no to the wrong thing at a precarious business moment, and the right thing showed up literally within 48 hours out of the blue, cracked us over the head. So when it came to people saying like, hey, we have a bunch of like focus group facility moderation we need to do, we would just start to say no. And eventually, not even eventually, very quickly, we had a lot of clients come in that wanted us to do this hardcore ethnographic, projective, creative work. We got known for it. And we never had to do a facility ever. So I rolled the dice many times, and it always came up deuces. But I don't know. It happened too many times for me not to believe in it. That's my spiritual talk for the day.
Yeah, you're right. But it's a wrestle for control, right? Depending on who gets to make the decisions.
Well, you could just say like, we're not like, sorry, we're booked. We can't do it. Or and I said this to clients a lot of times, like we were also project-based. So we had the choice whether we wanted to take the project or not. So I would have long-standing clients that worked with us a lot that said, hey, we have a bunch of like, we want to like test the qual for this execution. I'd be like, great, you should go call this company. And I'd give them the phone number. And I'd be like, but when you're ready to do something like this is when you call us.
I was wondering the part when you mentioned that you would just hang out with the respondents.
Yeah.
Do you do anything to record it? Do you take notes? Are there cameras? And would that change the dynamic that you have with the respondent?
That is such a good question. I mean, as you know, as a photographer, cameras can change the energy in a room, right? I think the longer I'm hanging out with somebody, the less I'm going to have devices in their face. And the less recording I'm going to do, and the more note-taking I'm going to do. Now, it's all personal, the way you pull this stuff off. When I'm in field by myself, I try to record as much as possible, even just discreetly with my phone, just as a note-taking thing. And I try not to bring big equipment into somebody's space because it can kind of make them freaked out. Now, I'm sure like you're probably like a really gifted photographer and know how to get into someone's space with a camera without causing that weird dynamic. There are photographers that do that really well. But I think that's a gift, and that's not my gift. So I just have to be careful with recording things and try to keep it small as possible. Even sometimes using my phone as a video recording device as opposed to a camera. Or if I'm going to use a camera, putting it in a corner so it's that they can almost forget that it's there.
And have you encountered clients that just want a video so that they can present to their bosses?
Yeah, I do. So we can do, like, we'll do that, you know. There's a couple ways we do that. One, you do bring the devices in and you just try to create an environment where they forget about the devices as quickly as possible. Another way that I will do this, if there's a little more budget, is that I will, there's a couple of ways I can do it. One is to conduct the interview without the camera, but then go back in on, like, once they're really warmed up after like 2 hours, and say, hey, could you just like say that one thing on camera? Because that was brilliant. Can you do that? That's really helpful, because by then you develop the relationship and the rapport, and that's really good. And I don't consider that cheating at all. It's just like getting them more comfortable. Another thing that I will do is, sometimes we'll frame up the research as a documentary. And so they know cameras are coming in, which is fine. Another thing I will do is if I find really great respondents and I have the time and money, I will go back and I'll say, you were our top 3 respondents. Can I spend another half day with you and just like get some of your stuff on camera? So there's a lot of different ways to play with this. I think you have to be really sensitive to who you're talking to. So like if it's kids, like it's going to freak them out a little bit more. If it's people who are like millennial influencers, they're going to be like, bring the cameras in. You know what I mean? Like you just got to be like really cognizant of who you're dealing with in this. And that's actually something else that it reminds me of that I just want to make, I didn't put this in. Always also be careful of who you're, how you dress when you go in. I learned this from my very first mentor. There's nothing that can like slaughter a Midwest qualitative project like walking in dressed like a coastal person. It's so true, because people are like, you're not my people. Like I don't like, I can't trust you. Right. So my mentor always said, like, you got to kind of camouflage yourself, and you have to like dress as the way the respondents would dress to set them at ease. In fact, the most successful study I've ever done as far as getting people to open up was I did a study of independent voters in Virginia after the 2016 election. And these were people that some of them voted for Trump, some of them voted independent. So it was like independent to swinging to right. And I was like, oh, this is going to be interesting. Like coming in from New York, I'm sure they're really going to want to talk to me, you know? So I rode my motorcycle down to Virginia, and I rode up to their houses on a Harley. And as soon as I showed up on a Harley in my riding gear, they were like, oh, she's one of us. It's cool. And Jesus Christ, did I get amazing insight on that project. Like probably some of the best insights I've ever gotten, because I automatically just signaled like, we're good. Like we're cool, you know? So that's probably the most extreme I've ever done with, and it's not even camouflaging, because it is me. I do ride a Harley. I do have grungy clothes, but like, you know what I mean? Like you just gotta be really careful sometimes when you're going into someone else's environment about the energy that you're setting, and clothes make a big difference in that.
What are the best techniques that you found to get people to be honest and tell you what they really think, rather than what they believe you want them to say?
Yeah, you know, you're never totally going to get around that. But I do think by doing a lot of the techniques that I talked about, which are projective and going into their environment, you are putting them, you're kind of breaking that down a bit, because it's really hard to lie. Like when you're in your own environment, you're giving a tour, or when you're doing a projective exercise, it takes a lot of work to lie about like what you think the future of sport should be, right? So when we go in false setups and in false environments, people tend to give us false answers. But the more real we can get in environment and in how we're asking for them to express, I think the more likely we are to get reality in the way that they answer. I mean, nothing says, hey, lie to me, then let's go into a focus group facility room. I mean, honestly, it's a weird ass room. And why would I walk in there and be like, yeah, I'm going to just like tell you the truth and tell you everything about, like, no, like it's literally, it's such a weird environment. So yes, you are setting up people to lie to you in those types of environments. So try to break down the setup.
Yeah, I was kind of like thinking through, and I'm curious of your perspective or anyone's experience on the phone. But obviously, when pursuing some qualitative research and when the discussion guide doesn't necessarily rely on the consumer giving feedback on something specific that a brand is maybe already doing or a particular product, like what are your thoughts around revealing which brand this research is kind of relating to versus kind of keeping that more anonymous to get the best out of your research participants?
That's a great question. I would say 80% of the time, I would say 90% of the time that I do the reveal, it's at the very end because I want to get the clean read before I get it. And it's in the last section. So that's usually how I do it. Unless it's a situation like we talked about, like where Microsoft is like, we're not cool, help us be cool, then I'll bring it up a lot earlier. But yeah, if there's a lot of research I do where I don't bring up the client ever. And I always have a boilerplate answer because they'll ask you, who's this for? And all you have to say is, it's for a big retail company or it's for a health food company. And people usually don't need to know more than that. They're usually satisfied with that answer. But yeah, only at the very end.
My friend helps run a research agency, and one of her big things is like if they have the luxury of it, they like to do ethnographic where they'll stay with somebody for like 3 or 4 days in a row. They just bring up a simple point of like on day 4, you're going to be getting such more rich, honest, candid feedback compared to day 1. It's kind of along the same lines of what you were talking about earlier in terms of like truthfulness. Do you agree with that like value in like extended periods of time? And 2, have you like experimented with ways of like checking in with people over the course of time? Like how do you view time, I guess, in terms of time versus honesty?
That's a really great question. I have sent people in field to hang out with the same group of kids for a week and a half at a time. In fact, that team it was an awful project. They had to go hang out with surf kids for 3 weeks in California and Hawaii. So probably the best qualitative assignment ever. But yeah, they hung out with each group of kids for a week and a half. And you're right, by like day 3 or 4, it gets real. It gets super real at that point. But what's nice about something like that is, to your second point, Pete, I really like, if I have a great qual respondent, I'll hold on to that person and I'll say, hey, can I come back and do a round with you in a month or 2? And I put them on my own pool roster of people that are great. And I'll say to the client, like, hey, I still have their contact information. Like, let's run a quick like video chat with them for an hour or 2 and talk to them. And people actually really love it because what you're saying to that respondent is like, you're awesome. And we want to stay in contact with you. We're going to keep giving you money to talk to us. And it's going to be super freaking easy because you know us already. We're going to set up the tech. It's going to be super like chill and easy. So it's a win-win for everybody. So that's another great point, Pete, that and thank you for bringing this up. Like when you have a great qual respondent, hang on to them. You have all their information, like hang on to them and use them again.
You talk about like the pros and cons of doing like qual and quant. And I feel that the two are kind of the peanut butter and jelly of research. So I like to combine the two when I can.
Yeah.
And I'm curious to know your point of view on that. Do you prefer to start with qual and after that doing quant because you are more aligned, because you kind of come from that, the unknown to the known? Yeah. Or you prefer to do the reverse, to start with the quant to inform your decision guide when you do the qual?
So this is one of my favorite ways of doing a research flow. And I have a great quant partner. Actually, you guys should write this down. Gradient Metrics. Don't everyone use them at the same time or else I can't get my slots with them. They're literally like the best quant partner that I've ever worked with. And I've worked with them for like 7 years now. And the way I like to work with Tom and his team, but you could do this with anyone, obviously, is we do some exploratory qual with, say, 4 or 5 people ahead of time that fit the recruit. And then once we do that exploratory qual, that helps us write a much better quant survey because we're getting some initial insight from people. We use that quant survey to solidify down segments and who we think the people really are that we're serving. And maybe there might be a couple segments, and we will run those against population size or propensity to buy or something like that. We'll figure out like who the market is. And then we use that segment to do a second round of recruiting and to do some really intense qualitative. Like that's when we do the big shebang qualitative. That is a very classic research flow that I do when I'm combining the two. And that seems to work really well.
I love the idea of being like actions first, words second. And I think that leads to a lot of these creation kind of workshops lead to a lot of really great raw materials. And I'm curious how much of that raw material eventually makes it in back to the client, just so they can see that process versus a final deliverable that's a deck, that's clean, that's quotes, that's a bit more distilled, knowing it's going to go through a massive organization that might not appreciate kind of those little bits and pieces that came out of those workshop pieces.
Oh, you're bringing up a great point, Greg. I mean, I love having a big dramatic moment with at least one of my clients where I'm showing them all the mess that we gathered up, right? So sometimes I'll like have them do drawings. I'll just take the drawings and like throw them down at a conference room table so they can see the drawings. Or, you know, if I've asked people to collect things, a lot of times I'll ask people, I'll give them budgets and I'll say, collect some objects. Here's $15. Go buy something that's $5 that represents this to you or something. And having that like thrown in their offices somewhere. I love doing that. And then taking pictures of the ones that are the most representative to put in the report. So that gets put around the company at a bigger sense. But yeah, anytime you can hit your direct client with something tangible, it's so memorable and it really helps them get it more.